Y'all, we getting ready for the guided tour. This guided tour is pretty cool. They're like, you can be like 30 yards away. Just don't, be too far behind. Head into the cave, y'all. So the cave is 7 miles long, y'all.
Under the water that we're floating on today, there's some, there's hundreds of old structures, barns.
Oh, they're still under here?
Under the water. Yeah.
I thought they tore it up and then flooded it.
Nope. So they, for the vast majority of the part, and then this is interesting too.
Now that's crazy, y'all.
Something that's also interesting about these bats, and bats in general, are they tend to be a keystone species within an ecosystem requirement. So the reason for this cave being such a bat haven is it serves as the maternity roost. Maternity roost is where the mother bats go in early spring. When they show up here, they're already pregnant. This cave specifically, prior to the lake being here, people had bonfires, there was live music. You go all the way back to Prohibition days, this was a speakeasy. During the Civil War, they manufactured gunpowder here. So the amount of racket and ruckus that happens right at the mouth of this cave has over time really negatively impacted the mother bat's willingness to use it as a maternity roost. And so we put about 8 caves like this in conservation, this being one of the more pristine examples because it has everything these bats want. That's why in the 1980s we put up the fences, we started doing censuses and counting the bats, and since then this cave has just increased in population. So we can't definitively say that it's just because of human interaction, but there's a strong correlation, and right now scientists, biologists believe that what really impacts the gray bat species is human disruption. And so they've closed them.
Was that one just now? All right, so in this clip here, y'all see that the bats are flying. They're flying really fast, they're really small, and of course they're very black under the cover of darkness of night. A little hard to capture, but we were hoping to see like a big wave of the bats flying over. Like you see something like a movie like Batman or something like that, but we didn't really see that. They kind of like trickled out, 1, 2, maybe groups of 3 and 4.
In 1967, we finished Nickajack Dam, and the river itself became so large in these places, because this is both Nickajack Lake and the Tennessee River, it now technically spills over onto what was supposed to be Georgia's boundary. And so the state of Georgia has sued Tennessee over this dispute, and it has actually gone as far as the Supreme Court. In 2013, there was some political theater around it. A Georgia senator came out here, and from the front yard of this person's house in the cove, drove a golf ball into the water and said, "I'm standing in Georgia, I hit a golf." Would y'all rather hear about Johnny Cash's experience in this cave? Would you like to hear about the Georgia cave divers in 1991? Okay, so I heard both. I heard Johnny Cash first. We'll start with Johnny Cash and fall into this body of water. We should have access to it. And so the Tennessee senator turned around and said something snarky, but ultimately they're still kind of in a deadlock over this issue. Johnny Cash was here in 1966, so this was just prior to the flooding of the dam. Some people even say it was the year of the dam being finished, but he was here prior to all of this water. And so when Johnny Cash came to this location, he was actually already a very famous musician. By the 60s, he had recorded a lot of his most famous music. He was internationally known. He was a touring musician, but he was also caught up in a very dark period in his life. He had previously been arrested in the city of Chattanooga for drug possession. He was also at that time heavily addicted to both prescription drugs and alcohol. And so he was at a low point in his life when he returned to Nickajack Cave, which is a place that he had visited as a child, being that he was from Middle Tennessee. And before this cave was flooded, this was a very popular hangout spot, like we talked about earlier. So he wanted to come back and touch base with a place that reminded him of his youth. But he was strung out on drugs. He was at a place where he couldn't access those feelings of nostalgia or warmth for his past because he was so caught up in his own illness at the time. And so, being so overwhelmed by his lack of feeling, Johnny Cash decided to, without a light, without any sort of supplies, only the clothes on his back, try and lose himself in this cave. And like we said earlier, this cave goes for about 7 miles. So back then the ceiling was about 50 feet tall. So 25 or 30 feet taller than it currently is. And he walked as far back into that first passage as he could, to the point to where the ceiling became lower and lower. And he could not only no longer see light, but he could actually touch the ceilings and the walls around him. And he continued until he was on his hands and knees, crawling through these passages in the utter darkness, until he basically hit a dead end, a place where he could go no further into the cave. And at that point, he said that he had given up. He gave up his will to live, and he decided that he would remain in the cave until he passed away. And then the following year, the cave would be flooded by water, and no chance of recovering his body would ever happen. And so he would basically become a legend at that point, missing in a cave forever. However, sitting there in the darkness, in the depths of this cave, Johnny Cash says, and this has been written about in his biography, that he had divine intervention, that God spoke to him in this cave. And what God told Johnny Cash was that it was his choice how to live his life, but it was not his decision how his life should end. And so at that point, he was overcome with a feeling of clarity and of purpose that he said he hadn't felt in years. And he promised in that moment that if he managed to make it out of the cave, he would quit drinking, he would quit drugs, and he would go back to focusing on not just his music, but the redemption that lives in the music that made him fall in love with music in the first place. So he said that he felt a breeze, a little gentle movement of air, and he followed that until he actually found his way out, which is tricky because sometimes caves have breezes deep in them that are not indicative of where you exit. So luckily he managed to maneuver all the way back out into the bright light. And as he emerged, he claimed that he was a changed man. He didn't drink alcohol from that point on.